But Jana, you firmly are going to speak about the environment and environmental policy. And what would be really good, Jana, would be to hear from you how you think environmental policy could be enhanced and improved and interjected into the CAP so it delivers more environmental outcomes, real environmental outcomes, yet at the same time doesn't mess up farming productivity and farming efficiency and farming economic activity.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. And it's a very good question to ask. Perhaps I need to point out that I work in IEEP for the Agriculture and Land Management Program, so I do not specialize on the environmental issues per se, but on the environmental integration in agriculture and in agricultural policy. But I've been listening actually very carefully to what my previous speakers said. And I do have a lot of respect for those farmers who are trying hard to deliver on the environmental objectives. So we've heard a number of interpretations from farmers who are here on the panel of what it would mean for them to enter this new world with a greening requirement, with 30% of direct payments received from green measures, cross-compliance applying to all direct payments, and potentially payments from Pillar 2 with potentially 25% of expenditure to land-based measures such as agri-environment, climate, areas of natural constraint, and organic farming measures. In the earlier panel, we've heard about the new rationale for this policy. DG Agriculture and DG Environment told us about their motivation for changing some of the instruments the way they did. But apparently the question here on this panel is how to deliver at the farm level, and at the same time at the policy level, and not the least for the public that is often confused. Perhaps I would reiterate a few things about the rationale for greening requirements and ensuring basic environmental management in relation to soil, water, biodiversity, and climate on farms across EU is essential. This is what comes from our research. We've turned out a number of reports on these issues across EU. Cross-compliance has played a role in this, but it has not gone far enough. So inevitably, Pillar 1 greening is a move towards providing payments for this kind of basic management on all farmlands. And indeed, much of what is proposed under greening is or was already in cross-compliance, and many of the additional measures proposed are in fact good farming practice. Now, what I would like to share with you today actually is some figures about the scope of green measures. We've already heard that not all farms are going to be affected. There are farms that are called green by definitions. There are major variations between the different policymakers, the institutions, in how this will be defined, but these will be exempt from the greening requirements. Then there are the small farms who are exempt both from cross-compliance and greening requirements, perhaps for a good reason. But perhaps to bear in mind that 61% of beneficiaries of direct payments across the EU would be eligible for this payment if we look at their income, and 68% of EU farms would be eligible for this exemption if we look at their area, because they are smaller than 5 hectares. And it's not only in Lithuania, we heard those figures from my colleague on the right, but there are a number of countries where, for example, 80% would be exempt in Romania, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Malta, Latvia, Lithuania. So how much land and how many farmers will be affected, for example, by ecological focus areas? All right, small farms and green by definition are already excluded. Now, if we look, for example, at the most recent proposal by the European Parliament that EFA should be applied only on arable land, not on permanent crops, and with a 10-hectare threshold. We have looked at the figures across the EU, and we found out that 75% of arable holdings are smaller than 10 hectares. Therefore, about 25% arable of farms would be subject to these requirements. This would still cover 90% of arable land, so I am not making this issue trivial at all. Let's have a look at particular national situations. We've looked into the figures available for Germany, and we found that probably somewhere between 2.1 and 3.5% of the current arable permanent crop area is already under some sort of management that would count for ecological focus areas. So it's covered by that kind of management already. If we started from the 77% requirement that was in the initial Commission proposals for EFA, in Germany it would mean on average additional 3.5% to be brought under this sort of management. Of course, it's an average figure, and we know that the situation will be much varied across different farms, even within the one member state. These figures that you see on the screen still do not include land under clover or other leguminous crops, which Parliament proposes that they would count as EFA. In the UK, the figures are somewhat different, but not too much. We found out that about 3.9% of total arable land is already uncropped under hedgerows or under that type of landscape features. If we added other landscape features, it would even increase. So it means that if the 7% requirement goes down to 5% or 3%, we are closer and closer to the kind of management that's already provided. So what are the demands on farmers who do need to take action? Because undoubtedly there will be a real change in land management required for some. There are a lot of arable farms which are very much lower than the 3.5%. There will be questions that could arise of farmers' understanding about new requirements, working towards a new optimum, choices of crop, land use, environmental features, method of land management. And the Syngenta speaker on the earlier panel was extremely good in describing that definitions, maps, rules, and advice are very important to provide clarity for farmers. Now, there is also added value for farmers because Pillar 1 greening and agri-environment climate payments under Pillar 2 are part of a logical whole. And greening measures can be, and in fact should be, a part of new Pillar 1 environmental baseline. This is what Tassos Haniotis was illustrating in his pyramid. And agri-environment climate can build on that baseline and provide payments for those more advanced types of environmental management. There would be also opportunity for farmers when they are working at landscape level and availability of advice and other rural development measures, such as you see on this slide. So with Pillar 1 greening in the baseline, you could get additional packages, including innovation support, skill development, infrastructure, etc., for the local strategic goals. So to conclude, a step change is needed if the EU is to meet environmental objectives. So far, the management has been introduced only on a proportion of the farmed area through agri-environment, and it has not been sufficient. So achieving this basic environmental management is critical. And Pillar 1 greening is not only about protecting the environment, and I would argue with the other speakers here on this panel, it's also about protecting resources that are fundamental to production of food in the future. Many farms are already doing a great deal for the environment, and they already meet of the greening requirements. But those that are not, then it is reasonable to ask them to do a little bit more to encourage this improved sustainability into the future.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Jana. Could I ask you to put that last slide back up again, because your third bullet point looked to be extremely crucial to our debate, because we've heard from farmers who think they're doing the right thing and doing it anyway, but at the end of the day, we've heard from our two seriously senior early speakers in the previous session that there's got to be action. Can I ask, with respect to slightly go off-piste, and to perhaps ask Michael Hamill or Tassos Haniotis whether there are any points that they would like to come in on and perhaps put specifics on, and I think we have to get down to specifics on perhaps the more general approach that Jana has left us with. One or the other, or both. I think both.
Okay, let me try to go back in some of the analysis also we have done, because one thing that we have to make clear is this was not about the farmers that actually are delivering, but it was done, as already Jana mentioned, about the farmers that are not actually delivering. Yeah. And that would be to the benefit of those that both don't deliver and to the ones that already deliver. It is interesting, I think, in the discussion to realize that there is not much discussion about permanent grassland. Everybody agrees that there is a problem of how permanent is. That's a definitional issue, and there is another definitional issue, what is grassland, because it's not the same thing in the north and the south of Europe. But nobody puts in doubt the fact that it has major implications and contribution to climate change. So the real issue is EFA mainly, and it's linked with crop diversification. Now, if we focus on the 90% of area that more or less is going to be covered, assume that you have a 100-hectare farm, which in my view is, well, a simple thing is a kilometer by kilometer, if I'm not mistaken, and if 6-meter margin is what you already do, doing it at the borders of this farm already means that 2.4% of the area is out already in the form of EFA. The real question we have to ask ourselves in practical terms is this rest of the land remaining monoculture? It's not. So there are 3-4 crops at least already there. So what type of intermediate situations can we see with field margins or other measures that most of the farmers that are already forward-looking already take that into account? For most of these farmers, the only impact of our greening proposal would be that they don't have to face what most of them would say was unfair competition with those that don't take these measures already. So what we're really left with, in my view, is monoculture type of practices. And monoculture type of practices need to be addressed because instead of actually helping long-term about producing more food, they guarantee that in the longer term we're going to produce less food. Are there going to be tricky details to clarify? Of course they are, and there are always going to be when you have to deal with such a complex situation. And that comes back to the point I raised earlier on. The simpler we stay with the measures that we propose on greening and are mandatory, the more the ambition is going to be. The more we try to introduce little things here and there are going to be some that have to be introduced, but the more we introduce, the more messy the situation is going to be in terms of actually implementing it and in terms of delivering what we want.
Thank you. Michael Hammond, can I ask you to pick up one or two of the points?
First of all, let me very much support the idea that many farmers are delivering very substantially for the environment, and that's even part of our concern, that how do we be a little more fair to those who are doing a very good job to try to overcome difficulties. But if we look at the realities of biodiversity, if we look at the realities of water quality, while there have been some very small improvements in water quality, and we recognize that, we have a good distance to go, and we have a long, long distance to go on biodiversity. So farmers who are very positive for the environment, I'm afraid, are not as plentiful on the ground. And that means that we have to have this, what the Commission in its proposals, and indeed what the heads of government in their remarks said, we need every farm to contribute. Okay, there may be some very small farms, and we forget about that, but we need every farm to contribute. And that becomes an important element in this discussion. Where we have lost over many years is in the landscape features. Now, if we're down at landscape features, and the figures generally used are somewhere between 2 and 3% of the farms have landscape features, or rather 2 or 3% of farms are landscape features. If we're down at that very low level today, then it's clear that it has been a contribution to the decline in biodiversity. So the 7% level, which is effectively a compromise between the 10% that ecologists would generally regard as being a reasonable level, and a lower figure which farmers would regard as being an economic level, we have to see that figure as a compromise. Let me just turn on one other issue. The concept that we will lose significantly on productivity, I think, has been questioned both in the impact assessment, and it's been questioned in practice, because farmers are very wise people, and they're not going, and some farmers said it already here this afternoon, they're not going to put the most productive land into the buffer strips. They're not going to put the most productive land into the ecological focus areas.
Thank you. I'm going to throw it open in just a sec. Gunter has just got a very short point, Gunter, I'm sure.
Yes, it comes to your point and view, and you want. I think for these farmers, I think for these farmers who are already doing something for greening, they need a kind of a credit. They have to have a reduction, because I think it's unfair that everybody is in the same pot and we find for everybody a measure. Please give us a chance to bring our existing greening into as a credit to have a reduction of this going down, like you showed in your 2% or something like that.
Thank you, Gunter. That point is taken, and it's been made. It's been well made. But I think we're here to try and shoehorn out how we can, if anybody's got ideas how they can deliver, how policymakers can deliver real environmental outcomes without messing up farming. Now, any questions?